Okay, everyone, welcome back to another edition of The Hard Sell. On The Hard Sell, we're bringing experts in all aspects of sales to you so you can achieve better results because selling is hard. And today we've got a special guest. Neeraj Agrawal is a general partner at Battery Ventures, and Neeraj has shepherded so many companies through to IPO, Wayfair, which I was a part of, Marketo, Coupa, Sprinkler. That's just off the top of my head. I'm sure there's a bunch more. And I sometimes joke that I've been working for Neeraj for about a decade now, since he's been on the board of the last two companies that I've worked at. So it's been great to get to know him. And Neeraj has like a very interesting vantage point on sales, and so I thought it'd be interesting to bring on the show and talk about it. So Neeraj, welcome to The Hard Sell.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you here. So maybe, I know the sentiment obviously has changed a little bit, and now, after sort of a lot of people not wanting to talk about Rule of 40 is sort of all in vogue again. And but prior to everybody talking about Rule of 40, there was a lot of talk about this methodology that you coined, T2D3. And maybe for people that aren't familiar with that, maybe just give us like the quick overview of what is that and why is it a useful sort of benchmark?
Yeah, sure. And it's I must admit T2D3 was kind of somewhat of an accident of a blog post I wrote, 7 years ago. And the blog post really was to kind of capture the journey for of founders in these early days, give them a sense of like what good looks like, or what great looks like. But there's lots of ways to be successful. But the pattern that I saw was once you got to, around the first step was to get the product market fit. After that, you got to roughly 2 million. You can argue whether it's 1.5 or 2 million or something like that, an ARR. And then from there, the path to get from there to 100 million, which I believe is kind of really every startup's goal, is to get to that point, at least venture-backed startups. Mm-hmm. And the pattern I saw is that if you could triple from 2 to 6 and then 6 to 18, then if you could double from there, 2 to 6 to 18 to 36 to 72. The last one's hard to double, but let's say it's a 1.7x, you get north to 100 million. And so it's an easy way to think about kind of what does that curve look like? How should I think about team building, capacity building, et cetera. So that was the basic rubric.
Yeah. Yeah, and you've certainly some of the companies that I rattled off earlier have been able to achieve that, and which is super impressive. It's very hard to pull off. And from a sales perspective, I'm curious, like when you look at those companies that have been able to pull it off successfully, like to what extent was sales execution a key part of that, or was it more about product? Like maybe just talk a little bit about how sales is played in.
It's a broader question of like, hey, in the venture world, what is success? And there's two key dimensions in this that we think about. One is market and the other one is team. And for the really great outcomes, you need both things to happen. You need market, and the team execution needs to be strong. And so if you don't have product market fit, though, great sales is really not going to do a lot, right? So you got to get to some base level of product market fit. And then sales has a really important role, and is a very important transition from what the founders are doing to what the sales organization is doing. And I talk about this in the article, right? I talk about hero selling, where the founders often are the one that are getting from 2 to 6 and then 6 to 18, but then there's no system in place to really get the next 3 legs of the journey figured out. And so sales execution is really important in that, especially in that 6 to 18 phase where you're starting to hire managers, you're starting to hire one level below. When a founder is, there's 3 levels below the founder of individual rep, and getting that individual rep enabled and working, that's sales execution. Hiring, what's the right profile, enabling the person, figuring out the messaging, coaching, all those I think of as sales execution at the end of the day. And so that's a critical component to really build a scalable, company. So I think you need both. I have seen great product market fit actually get companies all the way to 50 to 100, even with relatively poor sales execution. So it is possible. But what happens is you end up not having the foundation built well. And all of a sudden, once the first bump hits, you realize, oh my God, my sales fundamentals aren't in place. And so I think of the kind of the foundation on sales is really important during that 2 to 6 to 18 phase, so that you can get through those bumps.
And if and what do you typically see from a sales leadership perspective? Do you typically, so there's going to be a point where the founder sort of turns over the keys to selling to somebody else. Maybe it's like the first missionary sales rep, but eventually a sales leader shows up, VP of sales, CRO, whatever it is. Do you typically see when, from maybe when you're making an A round investment where a company is maybe in like the, single digit millions, are you typically seeing the same sales leader go the full way, or are there some logical points where, sometimes a new leader would join?
Yeah. And I think I would say this is definitely true in sales, but I think it's in all functions. The pattern that I've generally noticed is that you've got 3 types of executives. You've got executives that are really good at creating the playbook. I think of them as like the 0 to 10 or 20 million type folks. There's people that are great at kind of scaling out the playbook. And I think of that as like the 20 to 100, 20 to even 200 phase. And then there's folks that really like operationalize it, like, international markets, just the whole system. And they tend to be the bigger company, 200 million plus phase. Sometimes the same executive, and whether it's in sales or product or engineering, could run all those 3 phases. It's rare though. It's rare, and it's often folks think about it as like, oh, I didn't make it. That's not really the right takeaway. It's like, if you're really good at this first phase, that's awesome, and you could do that 8 or 10 times probably in your career and do really well. But doing what you're good at is really, it's important to know. And I think some can get there through coaching and develop these other phases if they have the right mentorship and inclination. It moves from a lot more individual selling to managing people and thinking about systems and processes. And some people really like that and some people don't. So I think it depends on the individual. I've seen, and by the way, this applies for founders and CEOs as well. Now they are the CEO, so they get the call whether they're still in the seat throughout these phases. By and large, I would say the typical company probably goes through three leadership transitions in each of these executive spots based on what I described. That's more common than not. But there are some cases where a sales leader can get through 2, and in some cases even 3. If you look at some of the large companies, that are out there, you've seen some sales leaders and some large public companies get through 3.
Yeah, and I imagine for you as an investor, there's some, one of the benefits that you provide is like some level of network or some level of your sort of being to help pinpoint these things. And so what you mentioned earlier about, there's no shame in realizing that you're not right for the next phase of the journey. But I imagine if somebody shows up and they do a really good job and that's seen by the investor community, you have other investments, right? And I imagine.
Yeah. I mean, there is, if we can hire somebody who we are familiar with, who's had success at one of these stages at another company, we do that all day long. The recruiting kind of roulette wheel, you never know exactly what you're gonna get. Whereas if you know someone you've worked with before, has been working with you before, and at Wayfair, like, give me a lot of comfort here. So there's a lot of demand across the portfolio for executives who are good at any or all those functions.
Yeah. What are some, say, you mentioned earlier that, maybe bringing a couple of things together. Sometimes you got to do some transitions, and sometimes you'll sort of run into a situation where the sales and marketing, or particularly sales execution maybe isn't good enough. Like, what, as an investor, what are some of the signs that you see that are indicative of, that sales execution could be like, is the limiter and could be improved?
So, first I'd say early in my career, I would think about like, hey, what is the existing team? Are they the right folks for many, many years? And now I'm like, it's okay, but we don't really know. We'll invest. We spend a lot of time with the founders, right? They are kind of, in my sense, the spiritual center of a business. And so it's helpful to spend time with them, and then they can decide who the rest of the folks are, the executives are. Things that I look for really are people who are process centric. So each of the stages, the first stage is like, hey, we got to figure out what to sell and like what's the positioning, and that's like somebody who goes on lots of sales calls, who might be closing the sales, him or herself. The next phase is like, okay, you got to hire some people And you got to figure out, like, are they good at managing people? And this is true with any sales rep to sales manager transition. Some people like it, some people don't. And it's important to figure that part out. And so often the first manager, somebody who was the best rep who got put into management, many times does not actually like managing other people, and still wants to run the deal. And so figuring out kind of, all right, what's the evolution there? None of these are, kind of like, hey, we can't do the investment, right? But these are just kind of things that you're like, okay, you realize that there are bumps along the way, you got to go through these transitions. And the person after that is really good at kind of managing multiple layers of folks. And you get to further along with the CROs now with sales, service, often marketing as well. So different functions coming together. But the HR skill set around hiring, managing people, getting the best out of folks, holding them accountable is a really key component to sales leadership over time. And you just get a sense for if somebody really likes to do that and if they're wired that way.
And as as sales has gotten sort of more quantitative, I mean, you've done, multiple, Battery has done multiple investments in the sales tech space. And, we've certainly seen sales becoming a little bit more of a science now. What about the sort of the role of the operations executive is like, complementing the sales leader? Like how important do you think that is? Is that getting more important or less important?
That's a good point. I would say we encourage our founders to hire sales ops earlier in the life cycle, sales enablement earlier in the life cycle, customer success actually early in the life cycle. It's somewhat unrelated to this, but it really gives you a sense of like what's being used and not. And they often have the best feedback that can channel back into enablement and product decisions. But there is a very quantitative analytical side of this now, and it's getting complicated. It's like, okay, many companies have multiple motions. They might have an SMB motion, a mid-market motion, a corporate motion, an enterprise motion, could have domestic, international, and you're hiring reps into each of these areas. You got ramped and ramping reps, and being able to kind of analyze all this and say what investments are ahead of expectations, what are behind, requires a data-driven analytical framework. And so I think a sales ops person who often looks a lot like the FP&A person from finance, but more sales oriented, is a great partner for the leader in sales to figure out, okay, what investments are actually paying off and where are we potentially wasting money.
Yeah, the further complication that I see, we have a self-service motion here, like as a lot of companies do, and that I think adds even another level of complexity, because now it's like, well, is it channel conflict in the sense that like, are the reps doing deals that we should have done self-service, or is actually self-service are we not actually, like, people should actually be going through the sales channel because they get better service, they might buy more, they might get better onboarded, and so they go self-service. It's gotten pretty quite complicated quickly.
Yeah, and another aspect of this, which is starting to pop up, is the increasing adoption of consumption-based pricing. And so you don't see it as much in application software. Application software tends to be seat-based, but in infrastructure software, you're seeing a lot of consumption-based pricing, and that's having a dramatic impact on sales commission plans. I think fundamentally even rep profile, because what you're doing now in consumption pricing is you're landing customers who don't really scale until year 2 or 3. So you need to find folks that are consultative with the customer, that can kind of own that relationship with their account management folks to help grow. But it's really impacting kind of core parts of the sales organization that I would say we haven't seen in a while. So I think that's gonna be an interesting evolution to watch.
Yeah, our point of view on that is that the buyers are showing up as more educated in the process now. And so like so much of it is, people get whatever G2 crowd, whatever it ends up being, like people are learning a lot before they show up in the process. And so like that mix of your reps time that's spent on, quasi warm leads versus cold leads, I think for a lot, even companies with very good SDR, BDR functions, has started to change somewhat. And so like the reps that you would hire when someone shows up as a qualified lead, that's going to start asking you hard questions from day one, and they need to be able to do a really good job asking you questions. And sort of is a little bit different than the ones where it's like the most important thing is just get people in the door, and then we'll sort of figure out how to sell to them.
Yeah, there's another interesting aspect of this, which is, in a kind of a capital is free world where we've lived in the last few years, you ended up with a very a kind of supported salesperson. They might have had SDR help, they had kind of product specialists, all these different people that could help, and they were doing some quarterbacking the deal, but they could bring in a lot of support. That was very expensive. And that honestly didn't exist in most of my 22 years career. This is really a last 2 to 4 year phenomenon. And what I think will happen going forward is the ratio of quarter-bearing sales rep to total headcount in sales is going to shift, where probably the majority of people will be quota-bearing reps, the way it used to be. Yeah. And so that rep now is going to need to become comfortable giving demos, talking product, and not bringing in somebody in to every single call. And I think that evolution is going to happen. And I think it's awesome for sales people because they're willing to do more, but it may not be a great fit for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think, there's, we see this more in tech than we do in other industries, at least amongst our customer base. So yeah, this extreme specialization that's happened, which does make sense when, you can spend a lot of money to try to grow, but it often is not the most efficient way. And for some of these reps that have come through in this highly specialized way, I sort of wonder if we've ruined them forever. Where now that's just their expectation. And it's like, oh no, actually you need to go, your pipeline's light this month. Well, there's this thing called prospecting. Like that, I don't know. So I worry a little bit that we've maybe coddled some folks too much, but.
I don't disagree with that comment.
So, I mean, maybe we're gonna have to wrap up here shortly, but maybe just to kind of to wind things up, is if one maybe interesting aspect for maybe for like an individual sales rep or a sales manager that's listening to the podcast is a lot of times particularly if you happen to work in venture-backed companies, you join a company maybe without that much information, and as a sales rep, your income is very highly tied to product market fit and how good is this company, and are they sort of trending up versus trending down, versus maybe a developer that's going to get paid mostly in salary, then or perhaps have some equity upside. Like the sales reps are very leveraged, and so like making the right choice about the company you're going to join is really quite a big decision. And so maybe like what would you say as someone that evaluates companies and puts a lot on the line over long periods of time into these companies, like if you're a rep with less information, like what are some questions they're asked, or like what are some signals that you're that maybe you're joining a good company versus one that isn't quite as competitive?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, and this even applies to executives. I find it interesting that folks are more choosy, in terms of companies they pick, given how much they have in line. Like I invest a lot of capital, but I do have a portfolio of companies. An individual executive or a rep or a manager, like they're betting their time and their life, which is worth arguably more than capital, right? Mm-hmm. And I will meet with over 100 companies and make maybe 2 investments a year. And the majority of companies that I speak to are companies that we have called. I want to mention again, we call these companies. Mm-hmm. When I speak to executives, the majority of companies they talk to are folks that a recruiter called them about. Mm-hmm. I'm like, that's kind of interesting. Like, how much thematic work are you doing about like which space to spend time in or the next 4 years in? And so first thing I would do is just encourage people to think of it like a venture person would, which is be proactive, spend time, have a big funnel. You got to do some networking as part of that to figure this stuff out. So like, okay, great. Well, what do I actually ask to figure out if this like space is interesting, right? To go back to your original question. Things that I think about are, to a degree you can find recently ramped reps being productive is always like, I think, an indicator that, hey, there's something good here. The failure state that you're worried that you want to be careful about is when a small percentage of reps are killing it and a vast majority of reps are not. Mm-hmm. Because that often means that the next set of reps, which you might be, may not have an easy time if you don't happen, especially if you don't get an equitable territory, which often happens in startups. I do think, to me, that's probably the best indicator. If you could get attainment data, like what percentage of reps are making quota, that's always great. If you get a sense of like, hey, will you have any real reference accounts in your patch? That's great. Sometimes sometimes you don't, depending on the sales model. But I think ultimately people want to know about like great enablement, who they're working for, and if there's enough product market fit. If you're getting a sense that there's enough product market fit, repeatability when you talk to customers and prospects, that's the one thing that I find that's maybe underemphasized or thought about is people have these sales, but they sell this pitch to customer A, they sell a different pitch to customer B. That's actually not as great if you could have like 90% of the same pitch to A and B. That means it's more repeatable and you're ready to go. It's a little more evangelical if you're still kind of trying to figure out the exact pitch for each person. But those are thoughts that come to mind, and of course you got to look at the VCs and see who's involved.
Yeah, well, if you see battery on the cap table, that's a
Hey,
good
I'll take
sign
that
for
plug.
sure.
I'll take that plug all day long. Definitely.
It's interesting. I once had somebody that did executive outplacement say, I forget what the stat was, but it was something along the lines of like, hey, like a really thorough, outbound job search, you're going to talk to, you should talk to 3,000 people, or like try to attempt like 3,000 contacts. It was like a mind-blowing number. But when you think about, what you were saying earlier about the way that you like, even like the 100 companies that you talk to, like there's probably a much bigger funnel, even on top of that. And so if you think about talking to somebody, get an intro to somebody, like it takes a lot of work to go do it. And I think what, I'm certainly guilty of this as much as anybody, but like you get so into your job that then when it's time to go find something else to do, it's like you're starting from a flat start. And it's like, you really got to understand that like if you're really going to get this right, there's a lot of work that goes into it. So
yeah.
And I think, especially for salespeople, you're like, there are a lot of recruiters, and the good ones are going to get calls, and, they're going to get pulled into stuff. And so it's like, I think it's good advice, so sort of just like if a company's going to get bought, you try to sort of create a market for the company. It's like, maybe think about the same thing if you're a seller, but.
Totally agree.
So, well, Neeraj, it was great to have you on the show. We could talk about this stuff all day, but I'll just wait until the next board meeting to catch up with you on that stuff.
Sounds good, Joe. Thanks for having me on, and have enjoyed the rest of the summer. Thanks for listening in, folks.
Yeah, thanks again, and we'll talk to you next time.
Okay, bye.